Okay. So, you know what we are planning to do today, right? We're planning to introduce our topic academically. In this class, we will take the introduction into a classic fashion, meaning dealing with the Quran as a physical text in its physical world, and also in its late antique environment. And that is for two reasons. One is a very general reason, namely that this is, regardless if the person who deals with the Quran is a believer or not, the text is quote unquote a divine text, and that divine text is also a historical text. So in any case of a historical text, the existence and the authenticity of the text needs to be established. In fact, in the case of belief, establishment by evidence seems to be somewhat contradictory, but is also as vital, right? And the Quran is a holy text of a very of a large, probably second largest religion in the world, and one that is growing and not shrinking. So adherence to that faith depends, if not entirely, almost entirely on that text as the sole source of not only inspiration, spirituality, but also of code, right? So existence and authenticity acquire even more relevance and importance. Did you look at the readings that I have attached to this module, to this topic?
The introductory ones?
Yes.
Yeah, I got a chance to read them.
Okay. So, how do you like them? If you have gone through them.
I thought the text about the history of the different translations of the Quran was very interesting. I thought like going through and reading how it was mainly, at least in the beginning, it was mainly used as like a tool for anti-Islam propaganda and other things like that. I thought that was like a very weird way for it to like go into the mainstream in Europe and Russia.
Like, I agree with that too. It wasn't, I mean, there were some cases of when it was used as anti-Islam propaganda, but you also read that the Catherine the Great used it kind of as a way of enticing, as a way of appeasing the Muslims that were in her new empire. I thought that was
Yeah,
kind of interesting too.
I did too. It was interesting to see like how the Europeans used it in their own way, Catherine the Great used it in her own way. It was interesting to see like how they interacted. And I hadn't known too before how like the Protestants in Europe had known about Islam a long time before like I had thought.
Yeah, it's like
Why was that surprising?
I knew like the Ottomans had a war with the Europeans, like the Battle of Austria. I just hadn't known that like they had access to the Quran and that there was such a movement like both for and against translating the Quran. Like the one article was saying how people were translating the Quran and then the Roman Catholics, the Pope, was trying to ban it. So then people were doing it in resistance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other comments?
Thought it was interesting that Martin Luther, among the Protestants, saw Islam almost as a Jewish sect. I didn't really realize that, and I suppose it makes sense that he was pro printing, since and that the Pope was against it, since of course they don't want the Bible printed either.
So, why was it so interesting that Martin Luther saw Islam as a sect of Judaism?
Initially, when the first time I read anything European on people's understanding of Islam was in French, Song of Roland or something like that, and the idea was like they're polytheists, so it was a lot of ignorance. So the fact that Luther initially saw it as so much like within the mainstream of Judeo-Christianity, I didn't really realize that, and I suppose that's part of the reason why he was like for the printing of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Probably. So, what else is very interesting, you guys?
It reminded me that Wayne State's former mascot was once a Muslim warrior.
Okay. Okay.
No,
Interesting. Go ahead.
No, I thought the discussion around the original skeleton of the script was interesting too, because in a lot of ways, there's always skepticism when scholars come to like a religious narrative about something, but then through the kind of the actual study of it, they found that the like the whole thing of Uthman being the first to kind of start that skeleton is interesting, because that's the traditional narrative, and sometimes it kind of bucked the skepticism and almost proved itself.
Well, it doesn't, and we'll talk about this today. But yes, point well taken. Other comments before I give you a little bit of my own?
As someone who likes collecting coins, it was interesting in the one article you gave us that like they were using I believe it was the Ottoman coins to date
Mhm.
like they had the Qur'an verses written on them, so they could tell better than like the actual inscriptions how old that was or what like time period it was from.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's also another very good point. Okay, so interesting. You guys focused initially before Jared spoke about that, focused almost entirely on the aspects of translating the Quran into European language, right? And so by giving these comments, these articles seem probably to be much more fascinating to you than the ones that had to do with archaeology and the historical context, right?
Yeah, I prefer these ones a little bit.
How come?
As much as I enjoy some like archaeological texts, I prefer more looking at the meat, like why things happened, not really. I don't know how to
How?
explain it. Yeah, not really how, but like I like seeing why in terms of like psychology, how people thought, why people did things, their action.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
The archaeology is interesting to me because I've talked with so many people of faith, and people oftentimes say certain things about their faith. So to actually look at, well, here's the evidence, here's the earliest copy, here are the earliest, that was interesting to me. Here's the earliest script. There's no complete manuscript dating from the 1st century. Like those kinds of things to me are interesting. So.
I kind of agreed with that too, because I do like the archaeological aspect of it. And I like the sense that there is like no definitive Qur'an in some senses, and that like there were variants even from the early times, and that's kind of interesting.
And really interesting too that these variants were approved by the Prophet himself.
Yeah, I found that kind of amazing, and it's almost like the variants were not variant enough to change the meaning. They were just variant. It's almost explained as if like, if that's easier for you to say, that's fine as long as it carries the same meaning. And at least that's how I took his response.
Yeah, I'd like to add,
Go ahead.
like reading about the سبعة الأحرف, سبعة أحرف.
Yes.
Yeah, like reading about the 7 أحرف. I don't know what you'd say in English, but it was interesting to see like the story about, I forgot who was in the story, but there was the one reciting one way and the other was reciting the other way. So they went to the Prophet.
Omar and Hisham.
Yeah. And the Prophet said that both are correct. Or he said that the way Hisham was reciting is correct.
Okay. And that's actually the point of departure for this class. You will notice in this topic that there is the archaeological aspect, and the article that has to do with variation readings and ahraf. Those are one category. And the other category is the printing of the text in print. And then the establishment of the skeletal shape of the Quran is the third point. And all these 3 aspects of the introduction are indeed the scope of this class in general. Because after this introduction and the definition of the Quran, we will be facing issues of rendition and the reproduction the oral reproduction of the text. We'll also be dealing with the linguistic issues in the text, almost exclusively structure and variation, and the metaphorical. When we talk about the metaphorical, we will be launching from the individual word to the phrase to the image and to the text in general. And I hope we have enough time to do that. But I am not going to overstress or to focus a lot on the translation and the evolution of the printed text for 2 reasons. One is that you can, in fact, read those on your own, and you seem to have already done that. And the other reason is my concern, especially today, is with taking the subject matter out of the realm of belief and putting it into its context. I will not only say historical context, but I will say historical / cultural context. And we will talk about that. My main points in the conversation today are listed to you in bullets in a page at the end of the module. So can you please make sure you could see it? It's called Introduction to Talking Points.
Yeah, I see it.
Oh, good. Now,
Sorry, just how do you get to it again?
if you click on modules, and if you go to the module that's called Introduction, and you scroll down, it's the last link in the module. Click on it.
Found it, thank you.
Okay. So believers in the authenticity of the Quran have these axioms that it is the word of God that was delivered to the prophet, and it's delivered to the prophet individually, sometimes when he is with others, and sometimes when he is alone. And these revelations were given to individuals and or to groups for recitation and or for recording. And the traditions go that the prophet, before he died, in the last year of his life, he recited the Quran twice before. The Quran was recited by some of his companions to him in full as well. By the time the Prophet passed, the Quran was not only kept in full in hearts or in the minds of Quranic keepers, Hafazat al-Quran, but was also recorded in writing on different media. Ostraka, palm leaves, shoulder bones of animals, and very few leather sheets. That said, the Quran was not collected into a book during the time of the Prophet or even afterwards. During the civil war that erupted after the death of the Prophet, a lot of the Hafazat al-Quran goes that Abu Bakr, the first caliph, was coerced into collecting, not compiling, but collecting all media on which the Quran was recorded and keeping it in a safe place. The tradition also goes that the third caliph, Uthman, was the first person to establish a committee for the compilation of the Quranic text into a codex. Into a book. These traditions are, as far as traditions go, trustworthy, meaning there are established chains of transmission. And as we also could see, Harold Motsky in 2001 established that Az-Zuhri, who died in the first quarter of the 2nd century of the Islamic era, has a solid chain of transmission for that. So there was that tradition. And let me ask you a question. Why do you think the existence of a tradition like this is relevant?
With the tradition, it retains authenticity, I suppose. Like you have tradition that maintains the accuracy of what was originally said.
How so? The traditions will tell you that there was a something and a process not connect this something and this process to the Quran we now have, right? I'm not speaking as a believer or as a person who has grown up within the belief system.
I would say that it validates faith to have a tradition that says we trust this chain of people, we know who these people are, leads to a consensus among believers that this is true, this is authentic.
That what is authentic?
The words that have been passed down. So if we say, okay, this is, for example, you just told us Muhammad recited this a couple times before he died as a prophet, and then other companions recited this as well, and then this was gathered, this is the tradition. So therefore that leads to confirmation among those who believe in that tradition and believe in that chain, that what they have is actually authentic.
Interesting. So what you are adding to Jared's comment is that this, in fact, is a validation for those who are already believers.
And possibly for those who would believe in what the believers say, the chain. Because of course we don't know them, so it's based upon authority, that you would say, well, these people are, this is a good line, these are honest people who transmitted something that was accurate.
It develops trustworthiness.
Okay, chains of transmissions are trustworthy. I give you that. And Motsky proved that in more than one article. And let me tell you something, Motsky was a colleague of mine. I wouldn't know, he was much, much more senior and established. I was beginning my academic career when he was already established. That article in 2001 was just published when I came into the university where he was working. I was doing my PhD. Chains of transmission are trustworthy. Yes, we know that. Chains of transmission are people who have been shown to have existed. Yes. And these different chains of transmission tell us that there was a process for collecting something. And afterwards, there was a process of compiling something. True. But that's as far as it gets. That's as far as the traditional evidence can allow us to believe. If that something is what we have here in this Mus'haf, is a different story. Questions or comments? No?
No.
Okay. I'm not saying it is not authentic, by the way. I am not saying it is authentic, by the way. All I'm saying is this is what the evidence allows us to. This kind of evidence allows us to do this. Good.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that having a tradition guarantees authenticity. I would just say that having a tradition at least instills a sense of authenticity and makes it more likely in some senses that there's authenticity. But always there's going to be bias, always there's going to be, you know, people's own perspective in what is authentic and what is not.
Okay. However, if you ask me, the lack of evidence for, so all we have now is an evidence for the process and what Uthman did. The fact that we do not have any material evidence for the pre-Uthmanic codex, sorry, the pre-Uthmanic material on which the Quran was recorded, and the lack of material evidence for the fate of the Uthmanic codex itself, in addition to the lack of traditional evidence or anecdotal evidence.
What about the Sana'a manuscript?
That's a good question. We'll talk about it in a second. The fact that these evidence do not exist allows me more to believe in the veracity and authenticity of these traditions. These texts oh, sorry, these fragments and that early Ottomanic codex, if they are claimed to have been seen or witnessed in the 2nd century of the Islamic era, I would have highly doubted that, given the fact that these traditions themselves state that they were recorded mostly on perishable material or fragile material. And also, the whole logic and point of establishing the Ottomanic codex was to eliminate and unify, eliminate variance and unify the text. Even those, there are traditions that you read about, that there was 2 other complete versions of the Quran that somewhat differed from the Quranic text, one by Ubay ibn Ka'b and one for Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. You hear about them. You never see the claim that somebody has seen them or they exist somewhere. Now, there are texts that were claimed to be written by, or that they were compiled by Uthman himself and finished in year 30, which is 650 of the Common Era. And there are also some claims that a blood stain on the body of a parchment from one of the codices is the blood of Uthman on his codex, because his historiography of Uthman's life makes the claim that he was in fact assassinated while reading the Quran. They have been analyzed and proven to be forgeries. So these claims are not valid at all. So that said, this absence of evidence is not evidence, I give you that, but the absence of evidence allows me more to give into these traditions. Any questions or comments?
Could you elaborate? There's a quote from one of the readings about Muslim tradition, and it's talking about the 1970s and 1980s and what was discovered. But one of the quotes is a discussion of Waynesboro's Quranic studies, sources and methods of scriptural interpretation showed that research based on the Muslim tradition is no longer capable at present of providing unambiguous answers to questions connected with the early history of the Quranic text. And that's quoted Ripon, 1985. The main problem was the fact that the study of the Muslim tradition took place in isolation from the description and study of actual Quranic manuscripts. So I just wanted to see if you could elaborate on that or not, because it seems to
Yes.
be some doubt on tradition.
It's in the 70s and 80s, we were in a phase of revisionist Near Eastern studies and Islamic studies, where the launching point was that traditions were forged, including the Quranic text, right? But this is a general comment. However, as we can see in these first two articles that I put to you in the module, yeah, that's a valid methodological point. Before that, the study of the Quranic text was in isolation from the study of the traditions. And studying the traditions on their own will allow us only to believe very few, to actually accept very few answers, like I was very limited right now. But if you go further into studying the Arabic script, the Rasm of the Quran, from both traditional and also the codiology aspect, you can put some meat on these traditions. You can put some weight, extra weight to these traditions. And I will explain. Traditions have described an evolutionary process for the Arabic script, and especially the physical shape. And one can find that very clearly in the 4th century. Very, very technical description of the Arabic letters in the 4th century by Ibn Najm, in which one can, with a degree of certainty, trace the historical evolution of, the historical periodization of some texts by studying the letter shapes and the traditions about diacritics, for instance. That said, we can notice that the Hijazi script was the beginning script, was the first one, historically speaking. Then the Iraqi script, Basra and Kufa. If a text like the text found in Paris, for instance, of the Quran, is written in the Hijazi script, it is convincing evidence that it was written in or inscribed in an earlier period. Add that to the tradition of building a codex. In late antiquity, the codex became the physical shape of the book. Of course, volumen still existed, and it was the Jewish tradition to use volumen, but not a codex.
Can you explain really quickly the difference between these two?
Yes, a codex is a book shape, and queries are collected to queries are eighths or tens or sixes of parchment leaves divided in half and collected together. So each query was tied to the following one to make a book like this. Right, that's a codex. A volumen is a scroll. That is irrespective of how writing is made inside the volumen or the codex. This is just the physical shape of the material on which the language is written or is transcribed, right? So in the 7th century, in late antiquity, the codex has become the established means for writing a book, for compiling a book. So yes, so we have now through the codex, the codiology tradition, and the Arabic sources in describing the evolution of the Arabic script, we can in fact realize that these texts were or belong to the early period. And now, in addition to that, we can see also that we also know, for instance, that the diacritics and the dots on top of or beneath the letters were introduced as an established tradition by the time of al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf towards the end of the 1st century of the Islamic era. And diacritics were known before that and were sporadically used. So we know, for instance, that the Qur'an, in which we call the Parisian text, has some diacritics to it. It is not established as a diacritic full text. And in addition to that, we also know that this text was written in a continuous script, meaning that if a word comes at the end of the horizontal line to the left, and it's in the middle, it has a letter that does not connect from the left-hand side in the middle, it can break and restart at the beginning of the following line with the part that does not connect, that connects after that. So a word can break into 2 parts under certain conditions. And this is also an early tradition. So we know that these are earlier manuscripts with some physical and chemical analysis. We know that 95% of that text, this text is 95% between the middle of the 6th and the middle of the 7th century. So what does that mean? That means that these, especially the one in Paris, which is really very interesting, allows us to assume that this is very early, probably 1st century of the Islamic era. And in the earlier part of that, not the later part of that century. Yes, it does not mean that this is the Mus'haf of Uthman. And al-Munajjid in 1972, through also an analysis of the Arabic script, was able to show that these texts are texts are old, 1st century, but these are not the Mus'haf of Uthman itself. Right? So what do we have? We have partial texts, partial Qur'an, that we are able to, through tradition, through archaeological structure, chemical analysis, and also through codiology, we're able to show that they belong to the first century, probably the earlier part of the first century, but they are not the Codex of Othman. Earlier codices are missing altogether. This is what archaeology, or what the physical analysis and the study with the tradition allows us to understand. Comments or questions?
No.
Okay. Now, okay. From the point of view of somebody who is not going to deal with the Arabic text in Arabic, is this general understanding more comforting or less comforting?
It's in the middle.
How so?
It's like some things are just very interesting to hear, while others are, you know, hard to grasp.
What is hard to grasp?
Certain concepts that are mentioned.
Okay. Would you like to give me an example or not quite? Is it because does it challenge belief?
Yeah, a little bit. Like trying to contrast between like tradition and textual evidence.
As a matter of fact, they go hand in hand. They tell you the physical analysis and the script analysis go hand in hand with the tradition. The difference, I think, is that when we take the traditions, we or believers take the tradition as covering the whole, as not limited of an evidence, but it's an all-encompassing evidence that the text as is authentic. While in fact, what it tells us is that the physical shape of the text may be as old, and it is quite it's quite authentic, the physical shape.
Right, that makes more sense.
But that's the end of what the traditions and the physical analysis tells. So, for instance, questions of the Word of God being this, and the questions of the Prophet Muhammad's outspoken revelation being this, are not answered either by these Muslim Arab historical and non-historical traditions, and are not also answered by physical analysis, which is Brian's point, right?
I would say that though, given especially with the Paris document, you have something that's very close, at least, to the prophet's time, which is more than honestly you could say about a lot of religious texts in terms of it being recorded so quickly afterward, and then having that kind of evidence that it existed in that particular form since then.
True that. I agree. I agree. But is this a slam dunk evidence?
No, I think that kind of evidence is not there yet, and I think some of that evidence, especially when you're talking about it necessarily being the word of Muhammad, that's a very difficult thing to prove.
Very true. That, Jared, and that hiba is in fact the point of belief. Right? So, because should we have been there, or should there have been a camera, for instance, recording the incidents and the events and the sounds, we would have been able to say, yes, this is the word of Muhammad given to the people, and then that would bring us closer to the point of belief. But we don't have that, and we will not have that, and we're not likely to have such clear-cut evidence. So we'll have to work with what we do. Any other comments or questions? Or even challenges, please? No? Okay. However, back to my question. Dealing with this text, given what we have just talked about, as a text for translation, will relieve you, the translator, from questions of authenticity like this. Dealing with the text from the point of view of analysis by, say, analysis or exegesis, we'll have to get into these issues. Right? So I will give you just one example, but I will not go so much into this. The fact that writing traditions in the Arabic script was in development as the Qur'an was being transcribed, like the Parisian text shows us, because the scribes in the Parisian text were actually making improvements and enhancements as they went along in transcribing the text. You could see that, like almost in real time. Could we, for instance, have recorded words in place of other words? could we have used in a transcription process that took verses from memory into a text have replaced words? Could we? Could we have replaced the position of words? Or could we have changed grammatical issues? These are questions for exegesis, but these are not questions for translation. So the authenticity of the text poses different problems for different purposes. Just want you to keep that in mind. Any questions?
Under the evidence, you asked the question in one of your points, are we dealing with a single text? And the thing that was clear to me is that according to Muslim tradition, it's not a relevant question since there's been one text that has been chosen and there's not really much of any evidence. I don't know, there was some sense in the text that there's like flugels, some other variant readings, but that's been rejected. So then there's something, I don't remember how you say it, the Sana manuscript is a pamphlet or something like that. But underneath they find that there's different ordering or some variants, but it doesn't sound like there's much interest in whether or not there's a single text because it's outright rejected that there would be that it has any relevance. I don't know if what your thoughts are on that question or not, but I think probably for the sake of the class, you're dealing with a single text, right?
Okay, so you're right. You've summarized the traditional and the faith-based belief absolutely correctly. But there's two reasons for that. One is that this is a belief, so this is the word of God, so it is the word of God, right? And if you ask me outside class, I will give you the traditional one. But question.
No, how can you reconcile that when even within the faith there are, at least 7 and as many as 10 and potentially more possible readings of the Quran?
Thank you. That's my next point. Thank you, Jed. My next point is that this response is a whitewashing that has taken place over centuries, from the 4th century of the Islamic era onwards. The Quran had a textus receptus, or a received text, was established in its skeletal form way earlier than a received text in its oral form. And we'll talk about this in a second. But as we will see in a separate topic, the Qur'an, and also today, there are variants and there is variation. But we'll talk about those. But however, so even despite the existence of these variant readings, the 7 readings, 7 accepted readings, printing the Quran by the printing press has further reduced these readings into largely 2 accepted readings. One is overwhelming and the other is just quite regional. So now we read most, like all the Qurans, you have are, and if you open it, it will tell you it's Hafs an Asim. It's the Asim reading, one of the 7 accepted readings. And the second one that is still in existence and in circulation is Warsh, and it's popular in Northwest Africa, right? However, Warsh is also going into extinction because now the printing of the Mus'haf and the dissemination of printed copies and the dissemination of oral production of the Mus'haf is almost exclusively in the Asim reading. So variation existed way earlier in the beginning, and it persisted less up until the 4th century, and then it's over. And interestingly, Brian, and this is beside the point, but it's an interesting point. The acceptance of the Quran as the best model and best example of the Arabic language was also in the 4th century when it was standardized and codified in the same century as the Sab'a fi al-Qira'at emerged. There was a tendency in that century towards standardization and eliminating variance.
Is this Asim variety the one that was standardized in Egypt and then moved into the press in Saudi Arabia?
That is very true.
Okay.
Moved into Saudi Arabia, and now Saudi Arabia took over printing the majority of Qurans. And now if you, for instance, are lucky enough to travel to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, and you listen to somebody reciting the Quran, that, if you don't see them, that's an Egyptian reciting. But we'll be talking about this later on. Any questions or comments so far? Any concerns or issues? Talk to me, guys. Okay. I just said a small comment that ironically, the peninsular culture of the Arabs in late antiquity was an oral culture. The codex, the written codex, was much more, was established and accepted way earlier than this spoken of. For the last 1,000 years, we have accepted this Mus'haf as it is. Form-wise, organization-wise, and scribal tradition-wise, it remained the same for at least 1,000 years. Right? And it's called a Mus'haf. Why is it called a Mus'haf? Any guess?
Is it just actually I'm not sure. I was thinking something else. I'm not.
Okay.
So I looked this.
Any guess?
I looked at root up in Hans Beer, and it did not help at all as to why it would be called a Musaf. because it was very much
And
like, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, it was just very much, I think it had to do with being incorrect in one's use of like diacriticals and things like this, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go look it up again, but
Okay, that's tasheef. That is tasheef. The word mushaf is اسم مفعول from form 4 أصحف يصحف. اسم المفعول is مصحف, and the root is صاد ha fa, which is a flat surface. The mushaf refers to the physical body of the Quran. Mushaf. This is a mushaf. If you have a mushaf on a CD, for instance, it's not a mushaf. The mushaf refers to a concrete body of flat surfaces. Mushaf. This mushaf has been established, if not, has been established as the tradition goes by the time of Uthman, right? So we have no evidence, no physical evidence. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that it is, and we also have traditional evidence in so many different sources that an earliest copy was in circulation by the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd. Interesting. The rest of my comment was, which should have aroused a lot of comments from you, but it didn't. The rest of my comment was that the verbal text was not established or standardized as early as the written text. The Quran as we have it now has been in variant readings that were known, studied, and in circulation from the middle of the 2nd century. That's the earliest we could talk about with a degree of certainty. It existed way earlier than this. It did exist way earlier than this. But our first, for sure, evidence for the study and analysis and awareness of these variations is with the renowned figure Abu Amr ibn al-Ala, who died in the year 150, around this, if my memory serves me right.
You're referring to the years in Hijri?
Yes. And I'm referring to the years in Hijri to give you the context that this was really early. So Abu Amr ibn al-Ala died in the first half of the 2nd century. So he lived in the first half of the 2nd century and earlier. So there was that tradition of variant readings, variant recitations of the Quran. And variation of the Quran was not anomalous and was also not frowned upon. It was accepted. And the evidence for its acceptance is not only that the Prophet approved of variation in general, but also it continued after the death of the Prophet when everything else was going towards standardization. The script was going into standardization in increments, and the text of the Qur'an in its physical form was going into standardization as well. However, variation was accepted. What is the nature of variation? See, that's an interesting question because for believers, this is the word of God that is supposed to have come to us through his messenger, and it should be from the messenger's mouth to us. This is it. How come it varies? Right? And this is a legitimate question. So, in the 4th century, Ibn Mujahid, who was an expert on the Quran, he memorized it, and he actually recited it to different readers with different variant readings. So he himself recited the whole Quran on different readers with different variant readings.
What do you mean on different readers?
So every established Quranic scholar read the Quran in his own way, which meant there were differences in short vowel, in long vowel, sometimes in consonants. Most of the differences were in sounds, and very few differences are in morphemes and in prepositions, right? So he mimicked every reader, every scholar's method while reciting the Quran to that particular scholar. And he established criteria by which he would accept variation and variance if these criteria do not exist in full in the variant, it is not accepted. If the criteria exist in the variant, it is accepted. And we have a full module on that later on. But it is enough now to say that Ibn Mujahid allowed himself to call whatever fits his criteria accepted, and whatever does not fit, he called shadh. I will not go into the definition of shadh right now. However, what I mean to say is that variation existed before and after Ibn Mujahid. What he did was that he allowed this variation within certain contours. Which brings us, these contours were accepted by the scholarly communities of his time and afterwards. And as the standardization spirit grew into Arab Muslim societies in general, in scholarly fields in particular, and the Quranic field in further particular, these different readings remained accepted, but are almost extinct. The only two that are in circulation now are Asim and Warsh. And Asim more than Warsh. Asim is much more popular than Warsh for technological reasons. Which brings us to another question. And this is a question I would like everybody to participate in. How do we deal with variation we do not see now, but it has existed before, in a text that claims to be divine?
From the point of view of a believer, right? Believers believe that the text does not change because God promises that the text does not change. So if you look at it that way, then it all worked out the way that God intended, and the text remains the same as it was when it was first revealed.
But it is not the same. There are variations on particular words, right?
Variation in form doesn't necessarily mean variation in meaning.
It's different.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, just
It's
because
it's not a different. Go ahead.
No, Hiba, go
obviously
ahead.
we're also
Yeah, Hiba, then Fred. Hiba.
No, I told him he can go ahead.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, you go ahead.
Well, just like Jared said, he's saying that just because there's a different variation, we know that there are different like certain words different than others, but the meaning of the Quran hasn't changed at all. Like no matter the variation, the meaning of it stays the same.
How do we know this? So, for instance, just I'll give you a quick example, right? Very, very quick example. How do we know? So if you open, for instance, Surah Al-Baqarah, right? First verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. What is the first verse?
Alif Lam Mim.
And
Yes, Alif Lam Mim. What if this Alif Lam Mim is a word or was a word? What if a variant that may have existed before, which doesn't now, has to change that?
What if it is, and what if it just?
If you guys, okay, hey, go ahead.
No, just what if it is, and what if it just further like elucidates the meaning of what that passage is saying? I guess the assumption is that if you are a believer that there's some kind of primeval form of the Quran that exists prior to having been put down in human language. And even though Arabic is the perfect language for doing so, humans aren't perfect, and perhaps the variation only gives more meaning, and not it not being restrictive gives it more meaning.
Okay, can you hold that thought for a while?
Sure.
I'll come back to it. Fred, what did you want to say?
I wanted to add, like, so variation doesn't mean that it's like the meaning is different. But it's important that you look at not only the different variants that you have, but that you look at the past variants too. And you compare the meaning between what you have now and what was available before.
Thank you. You are, in fact, making my point. And Hiba made my point without meaning to as well. And I'll explain. If you are a believer, if you are a believer and you believe that this is the word of God, well, the variation should have no place. And
Well, if
wait. And what if there is variation, deleting it in fact, abolishing it in fact, is a problem. Because you have to assume if this is the word of God and how God wanted it to be variant, then variants have a function.
okay, but you mentioned something like maqta'at, like they're known to us as, just letters that we wouldn't understand their meanings. That's something that's,
Why is there something in the Quran that we should not understand the meaning of?
Okay, so like what would you say alif lam ra means? It's like the same thing. We can't translate those.
Yeah, certainly. I have no idea.
There's some things are just not made clear to us, it's
Yes, something that does not make sense to us, but it may have been, and I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying it may have existed in variation. May have. I'm not saying it. Yeah. So yes.
If we take it to be the divine word, that just because we don't know the meaning of it now, that doesn't mean that there isn't meaning to it.
Certainly. For sure.
I'll join in on this real fast. For my Quran, it has English and Arabic. And for Surah Al-Baqarah, it says Alif Lam Mim, and then there's a little asterisk. And at the bottom it says, I am Allah, the All-Knowing. Like it could be, what do you call it? Like the first letters of the words, like.
Anagram.
Yeah, an anagram.
Is it?
It could be.
Yeah, it could be a lot of things, right? That's exactly my point, Fred.
I have a question. Is there an official explanation from like the hadith or something? Did none of the companions ask when the text was revealed? Like, what does this mean? They just memorized it without asking?
Let me look into it and come back to you next time with something. Okay. Now, let me tell you how I think about this. A variation existed, approved by the Prophet. Who should be the most jealous of the text? We have established traditions that show the authenticity of that approval. There are various fragments and references in so many different texts, traditions, and also genre of writings in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the Islamic era that refer to, quote, give examples from these variant readings. What Ibn Mujahid did in line of standardization is acceptable. If you think about it. he limited readings. And above all, he limited the ability to further make variation. Here we have to look into the nature of the Quran. The Quran is an oral text in an oral culture. And the fact, these facts have been shown in other oral cultures with literary traditions, that however established a text is, however widespread a text is, it is prone to variation. So variation is a byproduct of an oral text. And believe it or not, memorizing the Quran and not reading it from a printed text is still preferred among believers.
Right, that's known, so that, you know, it's preserved.
And it's not preserved because it's memorized. Actually, memory cheats us a lot. But there are oral tools in the text that allow it to be preserved. So accepting the Quran as an oral text in an oral culture is a good first step. Second step is dealing, and this is a mix between belief, philosophy, and the study of the text. The Quran inside the text is given to you in two separate buttons. And Jared just referred a few minutes ago to that dichotomy. Right, Jared?
Yeah, it's the notion of that there's some sort of form of it that exists outside of a written or spoken language that has to be then translated into a written or spoken language.
Yes. So there is, even to us believers, and in the Quran, in the text, the Quran as the ideal text is not in here. The Quran describes itself as being kept in al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. What you have in this Arabic version is Quran Arabi, a translation or an expression of that original text in a human language that happens to be Arabic. Right? So it came to you in a medium that you can understand. Variation is an aspect of that understanding. Now, again, please go to the Surah al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse number 2. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, good. What does that verse say? Number 2.
In English?
No, in Arabic.
ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين.
ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين. What does the word kitab mean?
Book.
Yeah, that's very solid response, right?
Right.
Kitab, book, right?
Have meant that
But-
at that time.
Say it again?
Necessarily. Said, but would it have meant that at that time necessarily? The root is just something written, but is that, I mean, because you've mentioned before, there's a difference between what qira'ah meant then and what qira'ah means now.
Yes, very true. And the word kitab. Okay, so al-Salah is described in the Quran as a kitab al-mawquta, صح? صح يا هبة?
What is it, Salah, you said?
Yeah,
Right.
okay. And الموت, death, is kitab. لكل أجل كتاب. Right?
Right, but there's like many translations.
Wait. No. Yeah. Don't look at translations. Look at the Arabic.
Okay. You're
Yeah.
right.
The word kitab. What does kitab mean? As a matter of fact, okay, if you look at modern Arabic, and if you now, like that we are in a war, have you ever heard the word katiba?
Like my name?
No, katiba.
Oh, Katiba.
Yeah.
A writer?
Yeah. Katiba is in fact a division in the army. Kitab in Arabic at the time is a sequence of things. Right? So the Quran is not telling you that it is a codex or a physical book. It's actually a sequence of, and it didn't say, that contains Huda. So this is an oral text that was meant to be consumed orally, distributed orally, and disseminated such. Part of that, I do not want to go into this in a lot of details, but this oral text was made so in verses, and each verse is munajjam, right? Munajjam is what? What does munajjam mean? Every verse is self-contained. And if you go through the surahs of the Quran, you would, for instance, notice that every surah has several topics. One topic can be collected from different surahs. So, for instance, when God talks about the fawahish, that's a general ayah. The description and the listing of the fawahish is in a different place. Marriage and divorce is in different places. This is how the Quran is a kitab. It's a sequence of oral productions that for you to study, you have to rework topically. In this case, variation is theoretically acceptable. The issue with what we have, or with what Ibn Mujahid did, as we will study in details later on, is that it has limited the availability of variants that could have given us more insights. It also has its good side, that it allowed us to rest assured that nobody has made intentional changes. And we will talk about these safeguards later on, and probably not in the third or the fourth topic. Any question or comment?
Did you say munajjim?
Yes.
And what would be your definition of that word?
Okay. Munajjam is isolated. Every verse is self-contained.
So
Is it because it's self-contained? Is it because when the Quran was brought down, it wasn't brought all together like at once? It was separate verses depending on the things that were happening, or if Allah wanted to address the Prophet and to explain something that was happening, he would explain it, like a verse. So separated means it wasn't brought all down at once. Is that what Munajjim kind of, like implies?
Can I play the devil's advocate there?
Naam? What did you say? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Can I play the devil's advocate?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, that's the point of this class.
I've been playing the devil all class long. Let me now play the devil's advocate. If you are a believer, you cannot say what you've just said. I'll explain why. If you believe that the Quran is the word of God, which is good for every time and every place, right? This is what Muslims believe. The Quran salih li kulli zaman wa makan, right?
No.
So the Quran could not theoretically have been revealed for particular circumstances.
Oh yeah, what weren't
because it's
okay, my
rare.
memory is not, yes, that's true, but I'm trying to say that there were certain moments where in the prophet's life where things happened and Allah addressed those and address those. There might have been, this class is for learning, so I don't really know exactly 100%. So it was more of an explanation, but also kind of a question to see what your reply is. So maybe there's something I don't know. So, but I believe those things that were brought down, those verses, those could be used, like you said, for other circumstances, but to explain maybe a circumstance for the prophet or to give him a verse so he knows, like an understanding of, what Allah is telling him. I think it's like more of a learning thing. So I don't, if you can explain that more or just help me understand.
I love it. I love it when we are testing our accepted beliefs. One thing this class teaches, and one thing actually the Quran teaches us, is not to take any accepted word as is. Study it, think about it before repeating it.
So can I ask a question? This probably comes from my ignorance of Arabic.
Yeah.
It's not a great thing to say, but well, not so like this word can also be like a mine. Would that make sense in this context, considering like what you just said, that each of these is a mine, something that needs to be delved into deeply to find its meaning?
Very true. Okay. Can I add to this point, Jared, something from the Quran? Let's all go to the first surah of the Quran. Most of us Muslims, and I'm assuming most of the students that I see here are, have memorized that first surah, right?
No.
Surah Al-Fatiha,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes,
أيوة.
in fact. Yeah, you. Okay. So, what is Surah Al-Fatiha? What does it do? What's the job of Surah Al-Fatiha? What is its function?
Al-Fatiha meaning like the introduction.
That's not my question.
Is that your question, right? What
No,
is the
sir.
mean or
No, I didn't say meaning. I said function.
the function?
Yes.
I would assume to set up what the Quran is.
Does it?
That's what I'm asking.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين آمنوا.
أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
And so what is it?
Sorry, we know that the Fatiha is just like it's the most powerful surah, obviously, and it serves as like the summary for the entire Quran. It's
Is it a summary?
Al-Fatiha, from what I understand, I can't say this is the true meaning, but from what I understand, Al-Fatiha to me is introduction, as in to what the Quran or what the Quran could be used for, and how we pray. That's why we read Surah Al-Fatiha.
As a matter of fact, the real introduction is in Surah Al-Baqarah, Alif Lam Mim, ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين.
Well, the word of Al-Fatiha literally means the opening, not the introduction. It's the opening of the Quran.
So what its function? What are you asking God in Surah Al-Fatiha?
So the Quran
Guidance?
is the book of like guidance for how to live like how to live, how to go to Jannah. And in Al-Fatiha, you're asking like ihdina sirat al-mustaqim, like guide us to the right path.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
correct. It did not.
very much. It's asking God for guidance, right?
Yeah.
And the guidance is in the Huda that comes in Surah Al-Baqarah. And my point in asking you guys this question after Jared's comment is that this text is a Quran is a body, kitab, that contains self-contained verses which all taken together are Sirat al-Mustaqim, which you ask God for in al-Fatiha. Right? So, the most important aspect, now that this class has shown that the skeleton of the text, the written transcribed text, is in fact not not a contemporary of the Prophet or Uthman. It is indeed very close. Accepting the evidence, it also is very plausible. Belief, therefore, is warranted. So now, let's study this text as authentic, because this is what the evidence seems to allow us to believe. However, the text you have now is one that has been standardized where variants have been whitewashed. So what you have at the moment is theoretically a text you can accept, believe or otherwise. It is our duty to study its language so we can, to study its language so it becomes a prerequisite for understanding the meanings of it. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So what you said before wasn't totally clear, related to context. It seems like Muslims, at least Sunni Muslims, I don't know about Shia, that's normally Sunni Muslims say you can't interpret this as just language because it all has a context. But you just kind of said that the Quran could not have been revealed for particular circumstances. So I'm a little confused about that. It seems like most Muslims believe you have to understand the context that it was revealed in order to really understand what it means. So can you speak to that?
Yes, I can, but okay. This is a philosophical point that does not have to do directly with the class topic today, but I'll be happy to talk about it. If other students do not have a problem with me talking about it.
Yeah, I have no problem. Go ahead.
We don't.
The issue with أسباب النزول, the reasons of revelation, where a context is given to the revelation of a particular verse or a group of verses. and see these verses in light of these contexts. And an example is in order. I want you now to go to Google and to search for ما ملكت أيمانهم. ما ملكت أيمانهم.
What the right hand possesses.
No, it's it refers in some verses, and a lot of people understand this in the context of slavery and in the context of polygamy, that men are allowed to have intercourse only with their wives and with the female slaves they own. Right?
Right.
At the same time, the Quran is full of ways to abolish slavery. And now we have no slavery. Is the Quran idle? Are these verses now idle? Were these verses timed? With the abolishment of slavery, they are useless? I'm fine with that. But if you are a believer, you should be vehemently against this.
Is slavery really abolished?
It is. Do you have slaves now?
I would say yes.
Where?
There's people forced to work almost all over the world, and different forms of slavery.
Yes, but this is not what we're talking about. Is people kidnapped from West Africa and sold on plantations. That kind of slavery. Do you have that?
Not in the sense
I
of a
mean-
human owning another human. I
Say it
wouldn't
again.
say. I said not in the sense of a human owning another human and having full
Yes.
rights to them.
Yes, Google owns us all. Yes, I give you that. But in terms of me going to the slave market and purchasing myself a couple of slaves, no, it doesn't exist, right? So, and also this doesn't correspond to other verses where the Quran can be used to set very interesting rules for society. If you take this ما ملكت أيمانهم and take it out of that limited sabab al-nuzul context, you would be able to understand that the Quran has a very interesting theory of marriage. That the Quran has a very interesting and untraditional theory of marriage to women. That the Quran actually has a theory of labor that can be interesting for modern humans. Adhering a verse to a particular historical context first goes against the immortality of the text, which believers assume, and also goes against unlocking the potential of the text. Right?
I understand where you're going at.
Okay. So there is a lot of problems with أسباب النزول. A lot of real problems. Okay. Any question about the introductory topic before we go? I hope I did not offend anybody. Okay.
No.
Then, go ahead. Go ahead, Sagar.
Oh, I wasn't gonna say anything. I was
Okay.
gonna say, I mean, I don't think you would have offended anyone because this is a learning class, and so to explain things or there's nothing
Yeah.
to be offended as long as we're learning about something.
I probably destroyed somebody's hopes of acquiring a couple of slaves, maybe. Anyways, next time, what I want you to do is, I will not go into it. I will ask you questions about it. The 2 articles about the establishment of the skeleton text. And then we will move to the second topic of what it is. What is the Quran? Right? And be prepared to have a wide discussion that goes into history, into belief, into theology, right? Okay. Any questions or comments before I let you go have dinner?
Nope.
No? Okay. Good. If this is the case, you guys are free to go.